So let's get started first with looking at our qualitative study and going through the checklist together. So here's the qualitative study that we'll be working through. Like we mentioned before, it'd be good to have the study open or downloaded or printed off. But I've also put up the abstract of the study here. So if you didn't have a chance to do that, you could pause the video here and quickly read the abstract of the study. The other thing that might be helpful is to have the checklist open as well. So if you wanted to access the checklist and have either a printout or have the checklist open, you could go to the CASP website. It's casp-uk.net. So if you go there and pull up the qualitative study checklist, that may be helpful. If you can't, no worries. We're going to go through it and spell it out and go through it in quite a bit of detail in the next few slides. If you remember, the qualitative study checklist has 3 sections. Overall, there's 10 questions, and the first 2 questions comprise section A. And basically, these are kind of screening questions. So if you answer yes to the 2 questions in section A, are the results and the methods of the study valid? Then you can move on and do the rest of the checklist. If the answer is no, then you end the appraisal because the study design was not valid for a qualitative study. The 2 screening questions are: 1, was there a clear statement of the aims of the research? And you want to consider what the goal of the research was and why it was thought to be important and how relevant it was in the current context. Number 2, was a qualitative methodology appropriate? So basically, qualitative methodologies are appropriate if the research seeks to interpret or illuminate the actions, perceptions, or subjective experiences of the research participants. This study was called The Impact of COVID-19 on Chronic Care According to Providers. The last paragraph of the background section clearly states, this paper addresses a gap by examining primary healthcare response among primary providers in Belgium. The study aims to examine how both content and delivery of chronic care is being affected by the pandemic. So the answer to question number 1 is yes. In terms of number 2, is a qualitative methodology appropriate? Qualitative methods are appropriate for a research question that wants to explore perceptions of a group of experience. So this subjective experience, examining the subjective experiences in this way is absolutely appropriate. So the answer to question 1 and 2 is yes, and therefore we can move on to the other sections of the checklist. So we're still in section A of the checklist, considering whether the study results are valid. However, we still have a few more questions to go, although we want to move forward and think this is a good study to continue our critical appraisal. The next question is, was the research design appropriate to the aims of the research? So here we want to consider if there was a good justification for the research design. So for this question, we can't really tell. The researchers didn't explicitly justify the research design, but it's generally accepted that in the context of this particular kind of research question, a qualitative design and a thematic analysis would be appropriate, and that's what's described in the paper in the methodology. The next consideration for thinking about whether the results are valid or not is to look at the recruitment strategy and think about whether it was appropriate to the aims of the research. So here we want to make sure that the researcher has explained how participants were selected and why those participants that they selected were the most appropriate to provide access to the type of knowledge they were looking for. And just generally, if there were any discussions around recruitment, any challenges or any barriers, and how they addressed them. For this study that we're considering, the answer to this question is yes. In the methods section, the authors state that they used purposeful selection in order to reach different practice types, and that the recruitment of participants was within an existing larger study. There is some discussion of the non-participants, or people who chose not to participate, not in the body of the paper, but there is an appendix, an additional file, which gives the COREC checklist, and there in that tool there is a bit of a discussion as to why or why not certain people participated. The next section for determining whether the results are valid is around data collection and whether it was done in a way that addressed the research issue. So here we're looking to see if the setting was justified, whether it was clear on exactly how the data were collected and the methods were made explicit. For example, if interviews were used as a method for data collection, were they semi-structured? Were they done in a focus group? Was there an interview guide? And then also if the methods were modified at all during the study. Sometimes there is a justifiable reason for this to happen, and if it did, then we're looking for some explanation about how and why. For the study that we're looking at, the answer to the data collection question is yes. The setting is addressed in the context and study population section. The authors do describe that they did virtual interviews and that they used an interview guide, which is available as an appendix. They also stated that they reached saturation at 12 interviews, which is also an important consideration for qualitative research. They didn't make a statement as to whether methods were modified or not, but we're assuming that they were not. And the form of data collection was through doing recordings of interviews and transcription. The final question in the section around are the results valid is whether the authors considered the relationship between the researcher and the participants. This is an important part of qualitative research, to critically examine your own role as a researcher, especially in terms of potential bias and influence during either or both the formulation of research questions as well as data collection. Also, we're looking for some reflection on how the researcher may have responded to events during the study and whether they had some self-reflection on the implications of any changes in the research design that may have happened along the way. In this study that we're looking at, the answer is can't tell. There is, in the COREC checklist, which is one of the appendices, there is some mention and consideration of the researcher-participant relationship, the fact that there was no existing relationship, which would decrease bias, but the authors didn't really explicitly explore potential bias or influence. Now we're moving on to the next section. So we've finished our consideration of the validity, but we're looking at the actual results. And there's three questions in this section. The first one is around whether ethical issues have been taken into consideration. So here we're looking to see if the authors explained whether there are sufficient details on how the research was explained to participants, for us to be able to understand whether ethical standards were maintained. We're also looking to see if the researcher discussed any issues around informed consent, confidentiality, or the effects of the study on participants during the study. And finally, often this is validated through research ethics approval. So it's important to note whether that has been taken into consideration. So for this study, the answer to the ethical issues consideration is yes. Ethical approval was addressed in the paper in the ethics declaration section at the end of the paper. So many journals and many conference abstracts will have a separate ethics section that's outside of the body of the paper. Sometimes it's in the body of the paper. There were some details on how the research was explained to participants in the correct checklist. The authors mentioned that they gave information handouts. So the next part of the checklist for the results section is the data analysis, and this is a big one. So we're asking the question, was the data analysis sufficiently rigorous? Here we want to consider if there was an in-depth description of the analysis process. Often we'll be using thematic analysis in qualitative research. So we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of how categories and themes were derived from the data. We want to know how the authors may have explained how the data were selected from the original sample or the transcriptions, so that we have a better understanding of the analysis process. We want to make some reflections on whether sufficient data are presented to support the findings, understand if there were any contradictory data. There usually are, and how they were taken into account. And we also want to know whether the researchers critically examine their own role, because there is a potential bias or potential influence both during the data collection phases, but also during analysis or selection of the data for presentation. So for this study, we've had to say no with some caveats for this. So the authors did use a thematic analysis approach and described it, which itself was rigorous. However, there was less exploration of how the themes were derived. They did mention that they applied a chronic care model framework, but it's not immediately clear how that was relevant necessarily or applied to the analysis. And there was really no mention of how contradictory data was handled or other issues of confounding bias or the researchers' roles or influence. The final question in this section around results is if there's a clear statement of findings. Here we want to consider if the findings are really explicitly stated and if there's adequate discussion of evidence both for and against the researchers' hypothesis or arguments. We also want to think about the credibility of the findings and if there's been any discussion around that by the researchers, and ensure that the findings are discussed in relation to the actual original research question and goals and aims of the study that was presented. So for this one around statement of findings, we selected yes. The discussion section really addressed explicitly the findings. In terms of validation, 2 separate analysts were used for deducing the findings, and the findings were in good support of the original research questions. The last question and the last section of the qualitative CASP checklist is for us to consider, will the results help locally? How valuable is the research? And here we want to understand the contribution of the study, what the contribution that the study makes to existing knowledge or existing learnings, putting it into context of current practices or policies or evidence. We want to see if the authors had any thoughts around identifying new areas where further research is necessary, and whether they discussed whether their particular findings could be transferred to other populations or thought about other ways in terms of future impact of the research and how the research results might be used. So in terms of the answer to this from our perspective, the answer is yes. The research seemed to be quite valuable. The study highlighted gaps in the continuity of care during the COVID-19 pandemic and might be helpful for primary care practitioners that work in a similar context to plan around future pandemics. It's a bit hard to say whether this would be valuable for other settings outside Europe, as other settings may have different models of primary health care and different social or cultural environments. But overall, I think, from my perspective anyway, I thought it was a well done study. There were some gaps in terms of that were highlighted by the CASP checklist, but overall a really interesting study that was really quite well done.